Yeah, let's go for it.
Okay, great. So I'm here with Terrell. Am I saying that right?
You are, yes.
Yeah, and this is the Try to Hit the Pool podcast, and we're going to talk about all things kind of AGP, but also men and how men can deal with just kind of the everyday lives and issues of being men. So welcome to the show, Aaron. So I want to get started with just an introduction about you and kind of what led you here.
Okay, yeah. So I appreciate it. I am not a man personally, but a lot of people don't know that looking at me. But I have the other end of the experience that you did, right? So I am a female to male transitioner, or not exactly true. That it's just a colloquial term, I guess. But anyway, yeah. So I transitioned 12 or 13 years ago, and about 6 years ago, I got kind of aware of what we now know as rapid onset gender dysphoria, or kind of like trends of young women identifying as trans and transitioning seemingly out of the blue. And I was quite concerned about it, and just started kind of slowly investigating into what was going on, and then trying to kind of communicate that with the wider world and people who are also concerned about it, but were coming from it completely externally, seeing this trend happening. I thought I could help kind of shed some light on that from having kind of somewhat come from within it. So then around 2020, I launched the Transparency podcast with Aaron Kimberly, and in conjunction with that, we had the Gender Dysphoria Alliance, the whole purpose of which, again, was kind of educating about the experience of gender dysphoria, and kind of removed from the ideological lens that it basically has to be spoken about through, according to most trans activists. So yeah, that's kind of just where I've been. Where it came from, what I've been doing online lately.
Okay. Yeah. And I guess it follows from the last question, but how do you? So you said that you were interested in rapid onset gender dysphoria. So looking into it, the WPATH, which we don't have the greatest opinion of, but they reject it as unproven. What are your kind of opinions on that?
Well, I think it's it's self-evident, I believe. They want it to not be true, because they obviously want the trans experience to be innate, intrinsic, unsocially influenced, unsocially mitigated, because obviously that helps their case. But it's just abundantly, obviously, true, as far as I could see. And a lot of the trans activists kind of accused me after the fact of like falling for turf rhetoric and like buying in the whole these transphobic narratives about rapid onset gender dysphoria. Whereas no, I saw it happening before I knew that there was a term for that, or before I knew that parents were concerned about this, that clinicians, very few, but some clinicians were concerned about it. I saw it happening, and was really, really relieved when I realized people were talking about this, concern, alarms were being sounded, just because it was something that I witnessed firsthand of young females, like 20, 25 year range, transitioning, taking testosterone, having surgeries, all while not actually having an experience of gender dysphoria, and basically kind of talking about it as though it is a social phenomenon that they've aligned themselves with.
So do you think a lot of people think that the rapid onset gender dysphoria only really applies to girls? Do you think that's true, or do you think that there's some sort of, because I feel with the people I've spoken to, and with my own personal experience, it's something that was kind of in the back of my mind, but it's not necessarily something that the onset of it was quite rapid. Do you think? Do you subscribe to the idea that there isn't kind of the incentives laid there for men in the same way that there are for women?
Well, so I used to think that, yes, there was definitely an analogous version happening in the males, but I think actually what's going on is it's coming from, it's an innate desire that's already there, but it is now socially incentivized. And so I think, so it's two things, right? There's the internal drive for feminine embodiment, or whatever you want to call it, and I think I think this is fairly common in a lot of men, but I think historically it's always been so socially discouraged and just discouraged through various means, that it was most could pretty well keep it under wraps. It was this occasional thing that they may have, fantasized about or wished they could do, but it was like, not in a million years would I ever blow up my life, become, social pariah for this. Obviously there were a rare few who were absolutely committed to it and had no choice in their minds and they went for it. But I think what we're looking at today is just a cultural trend of vilifying masculinity and maleness and celebrating all things queer and and so I think there's a massive social incentive for boys and men who would have buried and repressed this to make it their full-time identity.
So do you think that, because there's a lot of like research into I was reading just today the James Damore memo, the Google memo, where he talked about the idea that men are driven by status. Do you think that the idea that men can gain status now from doing this is something that could be related to a societal aspect? And I guess as well, you would, like what you said is still valid, that the underlying issue would still be, that sort of thing. But do you think that maybe it's because it's now there's a status bond to it? Do you think that grows the incentive to do it in a way?
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that in terms of chasing status, but that is what. I think again, it's just there's going to be a different factors as far as external pulls, external encouragement and internal motivation, and everybody's going to weigh out the pros and cons of what they're losing versus what they're gaining. I just don't think that any man is going to seek medical transition and a female identity purely for to gain social rank. I think there is always what we'll get to, but underlying autogynephilia is, I think, pretty much virtually always the core.
So you kind of think that's always kind of a base level with men, because there's I guess the thing that gets caught up in the weeds is there's obviously a lot of factors to it, but it's where the base comes from with a lot of the stuff is what's important, right? Because like you said, people are going to consider factors. They're not just going to jump into something because of one reason. It's whether they're motivated by an underlying sexual aspect or whether they're motivated by an underlying whatever view you subscribe to. There's a base level and then there's multiple factors. Would you agree with that kind of idea?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And I think what people misunderstand with autogynephilia is that it's like a fetish or it's overtly sexual. In a lot of cases, it's a kind of a romantic, emotional pull that they won't even necessarily identify as related to sexuality.
So before we go there, what is AGP and what does it kind of mean to you? So imagine I'm an alien who doesn't know anything about any of this.
So the base definition is a male's propensity to be aroused by the thought or image of himself as a woman or feminine. That's because I think what's missing here in this definition is the root cause, what's going on underneath it all. I think it is like a misfiring heterosexual desire, like a misfiring needing to be what it is you are externally attracted to, and the scientists, the sexologists who are studying it could measure arousal. And so that's what it's primarily spoken about and considered in terms of today. But I think it's much deeper than that. It's like, that is just, I think how I think of it is like gender dysphoria, like an aversion to one's sex body, or what we now know is like a euphoria or arousal. I think those are two symptoms of the same underlying root cause of needing to be that which you externally value, find attractive. I think it's like a misfiring, essentially, is what I've concluded.
And then I guess, so you're saying that, because the way I've spoken to some people, they kind of, it ends up getting broken down to so many parts that it almost becomes not a sexual aspect. The drive for status in men, I guess is a weird analogous way of putting it, but in serial killers, when they decide to kill someone, it's there's a sexual motivation, but it isn't actually sexual as such. So it's like the idea that, I'm not comparing the two, by the way, but I'm kind of saying like the idea that these things that underlyingly are sexually motivated in the way that someone consciously thinks about it is not actually a sexual motivation. It's it presents as something else. Yeah.
I think in the unfortunate example of like a serial killer, it's like you're talking about
that example. But a better example is like a CEO who wants to buy out loads of companies. Or
right,
like
and you just can't stop. Yeah, it's insatiable. Yeah, that could be. Yeah, very much. Yeah, I think that kind of drive for status, and it being, I think that, that's more loosely connected to sexuality, because status is sought for in its own right, but I think it's also the underlying reason evolutionarily it's there is because that's how you get a mate, is by being, by being able to demonstrate your success, being high status. That's how you secure, sexual partners. But I don't think that there is a kind of, I could be wrong about this, but I don't think there is an actual sexual component behind the CEO. Like, I don't think he's getting turned on by each acquisition, but whereas with serial killers, I think it's actually underlying sadism, sexual sadism that brings them to that to that end result. Whereas AGP is a lot more morally neutral and
no, of course. I'll just say I personally subscribe to the idea of just that there is a third reason going on for men, the same as women. I think there is something to be said about the status thing. I think there is something to be said about gaining something in society. I'm not exactly sure how to pinpoint it, and I want to listen to what other people say, because I want to make sure that I'm, I have everything that's taken in. But I guess the next thing I would say is, what do people get wrong about AGP?
I guess that it is purely sexual. I think when a lot of people understand it as a fetish, and I think that they understand it as such because that's what they can visually see, but that's not the internal motivation of the individual who has AGP. It is much more, it's much closer to an orientation, is how it feels, how it's experienced. And it is the primary source of gender dysphoria in males. And a lot of times, it manifests as people will think that AGP is narcissism. Absolutely no, not the case. It very often manifests as self-loathing, just because, again, the brain is expecting one thing and is presented with something else, and that's the cause of dysphoria. But I think just people have a very shallow understanding of it, I guess, and that's what I'm trying to correct.
Yeah, so I guess that's why I kind of asked, is what is the deeper understanding? Because in the same theory, the Blanchardian theory, you have the is it HRTS, the homosexual one?
HSTS.
HSTS, where they essentially, the idea is that they transition for social pressures. Now, I personally don't know if it's
sorry
to understand, because, to be honest, I'm bisexual, so I could very much fall into either category. So it's quite, so I don't know with the homosexual variant. It's because that one's driven by societal pressures. I find it hard to logically, and this is my problem, I'm probably approaching it from too much of a logical angle, is that I find it hard to understand why there wouldn't also be a societal pressure version for straight males. Oh, I've lost you. I've lost your audio.
Sorry about that. My dog started freaking out, so I muted myself. So with the original studying, what they with the straight and bisexual, or even asexual identified males, or lifestyle wise, it always came back to arousal. That they were aroused either by feminine attire or fantasies, etc. Whereas the distinction for the HSTS is there was no associated arousal with feminine presentation. It was just, less transitioning made their lives much more. And it wasn't even about status. It wasn't seeking status in the same way we've been talking about straight men seeking status. It was definitely a reduction in social friction, and the ability to have straight male partners was kind of like the motivation there. It's very pragmatic. Whereas I think for the straight and bisexual males, it was much more of an internally driven, originating pull, I guess. Yeah. And that's the thing, is I thought forever that there was an analogous, rapid onset version in males, but the more that I spoke to them, the more that I looked in their forums and everything, it always goes back to that arousal element being there, and that's why.
I guess the critical thinking part of me would say that if you're going to transition and then one, pleasures oneself or whatever, wouldn't you always end up thinking of yourself in the scenario where you are a female in that scenario because you're pleasuring yourself and you want to be female. So that's what, isn't it a self-fulfilling prophecy in that regard?
It depends on who it is. So there's different experiences of AGP where it's specifically the fantasy about being female and masturbating to that fantasy, etc. But then there are those for whom it's completely not compulsory. I'm not sure the word I'm looking for, but it's automatic. Like they hate the fact that they have an arousal response to wearing a skirt or whatever. But it's there. And then that's the pull of HRT. You go on the hormones, and the libido is reduced, and a lot of those kinds of arousal responses to this diminish or entirely go away. But yeah, for you to associate okay, so you want to be a woman and there's a sexual fantasy element with that, that's just AGP. I think for so many people externally, they don't understand how connected it is to
do you understand what I'm saying in the aspect that if we were to put our brains into the gender identity idea, which I'm not saying is right, I'm just saying if we put our brains into that idea and we said, okay, someone who wants to be female, then wouldn't they always imagine themselves as female in a sexual scenario? That's what I mean. See, more what I guess it's more a philosophical question of almost, I think, that I think therefore I am. So the problem with making, and I don't agree or disagree. I'm just trying to, how would you make that argument without that pitfall is what I'm trying to say.
So yeah, that is the kind of the transactivist explanation for the the sexual association. They're like, well, this is my gender identity, so of course when I'm having sex or being sexual, I'm thinking of myself in terms of this gender identity. But it seems like a post hoc rationalization, whereas it's kind of clear, because for even people who don't want to transition, who don't have a female identity, etc., they can still have the same.
So let's talk a bit about that. What's kind of your experience? So that to me would be interesting, because that's where the logical thing would kind of break down. So your experience, because you mentioned briefly in the twist back and forth that we had, that it's kind of analogous to the male experience. What do you mean by that with AGP being part of it?
Being part of
kind of the male experience, men who don't don't transition, who don't seek that sort of thing, also feeling this way. What's that kind of
right, yeah. So because I think what I'm saying is there are men who have sexual fantasies around being female, but they don't they don't have a female identity, sense of self, or seek to transition. I think it's just the social framework, the social offering that's being given to a lot of men who have this experience, and it makes sense for them. Especially again, when it's really important. What I've been talking about lately a lot is libido levels and just kind of the different experience of sexual orientation and whatnot. That's variable across all people. And so I think for some, they kind of experience it as distinctly and concretely sexual, and then others who experience it more as a kind of more nebulous sense of themselves, part of their core identity kind of thing. And I think so much of this has to do with the culture you're raised in, how acceptable feminine expression is in a male, etc. There's pretty much, I've been looking into this a long time, and there's no real other explanation other than AGP, especially when it always goes back to the same kind of core experience. And I think, I'm not sure if that answers your question, but I think the kind of where the other thing that I kind of want people to understand, that I'm kind of an outlier in here, or not an outlier, there's a few of us now, but basically saying that this experience happens in females as well. And that's what makes it, I think.
Is that so? For example, I'd start off with, I've met a few transitioners the other way around, and basically one of them said that I think their phrase was oh, I like glam rock, and I really wanted to be with gay men, so I realized I was just a gay man. Is that kind of the similar, talking about sexual fantasies being with gay men? Is that the kind of do they call it autoandrophilia? Is that right?
Yeah. Autoandrophilia. Yeah. So So I think, yeah, that attraction. So a big part of, and this is what my entire podcast is about, the navel gaze is about meta-sexuality, and that's, I think, a lot of cases what that is they are attracted to femininity in males because that's a way to feel more masculine relative to those males.
Okay, yeah, that
so you
makes sense.
see, so you see that a lot in female transitioners, is an attraction to gay men, effeminate men. You look historically at these relationships and these pairings. It's actually a fact that what I now see as AAPs and AGPs often wound up together, which makes sense because they're kind of fulfilling each other's external target attraction to the opposite sex, while at the same time meta attraction to those who play the opposite gender role, essentially, in the confines of a relationship. And so I think before we had the whole trans trend, a lot of people were mitigating their gender feelings that way.
You definitely see that a lot of German people.
Yeah. Okay.
It's definitely very common in Europe. Okay, no, this is really interesting. You've given a really good description of it, and it makes a lot of sense the way that you're wording it as well. So you would see it as kind of a, like we spoke about, you'd see it as a base level, but obviously you think that there's other extenuating factors to why it's growing and why it's becoming more of a big thing, like the social aspects and things like that. I guess I wanted to ask you, because honestly, I didn't know that you were a transitioner before I invited you on. But I wanted to ask you.
Really?
Yeah, no, I didn't. So, but this is actually even better because I can ask you already, because you pass incredibly well. So how has your experience being a man or passing as a man been?
I gained a lot of sympathy for men, that's for sure. I realized the world is much, much warmer to women. I think a lot of people don't realize that until you've been, because you only know your own experience. And living and passing and moving through the world as a man is it just feels like a very different world. I didn't like. I mean, I'm very comfortable moving through the world this way, but a lot of female to male transitioners aren't. It's very feels very cold and hostile.
Very much getting loser. We're going losing.
Exactly. Yeah. So, and then like the whole male levels of testosterone coursing through your blood, that's a very different experience than women are used to. And that's, I think, what I kind of got a better understanding about the differences in the sexes and our relationship to sex. And that was because I chastised myself a lot for this, because prior to transitioning, I held two contradictory views, which was the kind of the blank slate view of gender, that we're all just social, like we're men and women are the same, we're just raised to be different through socialization. I believed that, while at the same time believing that I had a male brain, and that explained my gender dysphoria, right? So two contradictory ideas right there. But I definitely gave up both of those notions upon taking male levels of testosterone and realizing, this is a very obviously I'm still not male. I don't actually have male psychology, but how much experience of testosterone is.
I mean, that is an interesting question, because you do see, like, I mean, I could be wrong, but I've never heard of a fully female woman planning a school shooting, but we've seen at least two. How much do you think this is linked to, like, testosterone as someone who's been on both? How much do you think this sort of stuff is linked to that?
So that the school shooter, she wasn't actually on testosterone, as I understand it. Yeah, she was just a very disturbed person. But I think there. So I'm kind of fascinated by the differences in the sexes, and one of them is women just naturally have much higher empathy than men, and I think that's evolutionarily important and necessary, because one sex primarily cares for the children and the other hunts and fights. We're talking like way back, but so it makes sense that women are going to have more empathy, and I think feminists and women in general should stop harping on men for being, lower in empathy. It's like, we're kind of, it's just, it's how we're wired. There's a reason for it. Yeah. They're not failed women. That's how they like to talk. But but I think that empathy still stays. Like, I think I feel anger physically now, whereas I never felt anger physically before. And
like the thing where it rolls up inside you and you want
yeah,
to
yeah.
You never felt that before?
No, never felt
Girls
it.
don't feel that? I thought that everyone felt that. Yeah.
I've also never been a very emotional person in general. I mean, actually, I remember like being a teenager at one time feeling that like when I was really angry at my brother, but that's the only time I'm now remembering that. But no, like I never really. Now it's like the minorest irritant, you know, comes as like a physical anger feeling.
That's how it works. That's the
yeah.
I mean, you know, it's funny. It's just kind of, I feel like there is a lot of that going on with the people riding each other's hormones. Like we do see, you know, to be a little bit sexist, we do see a lot of the, you know, men to women, trans people kind of staying online and moaning about everything all the time. Like we do definitely see things that are like, oh, okay, you're just not used to doing this thing.
Apparently estrogen, taking external or exogenous female hormones does make people more moody and emotional, which tracks. But I think there's also, because I'm really into the weeds of the whole what I understand is autoheterosexuality, and a lot of times people are kind of playing.
Sorry, before you go into it, just because again, if people don't understand, what does also heterosexuality mean?
So that's how I conceptualize the experience of both AGP and AAP, so autogynephilia and autoandrophilia, is the experience is autoheterosexuality. It is attraction towards the self. It's basically misfiring heterosexuality, right? And so it's attraction to the self as the opposite sex. I think a lot of times this actually manifests as homosexuality, though, especially in females, because they're able to play the masculine one in relation to another female. But Sorry, I got sidetracked. What was I saying about the?
Sorry, about also heterosexuality and just the idea that it kind of manifests. So some people describe it as like a boomerang.
Right. Yeah, yep. But so in the people with this experience, we were talking about like the hormones and how that affects our behavior and kind of our the psychology. There's another element to the autoheterosexual experience where people are behaving more like it's they're behaving like what they're attracted to in the opposite sex, or but behaving like what they see in the opposite sex. So it's like that's where it could be hormonally induced, or it could be like a psychological manifestation of what you want to,
what they believe that person is like.
Exactly. Yep. Yes. Yep. So I'm always like kind of cautious of that in myself. I'm like wondering what about my kind of all the change in my psychology pre and post transition of like how much is it psychologically induced by testosterone, how much is just aging, or how much of it is like this the subconscious wanting to embody something. And hard to know, but I'm consciously or constantly scanning for it in other people's behavior, like between their present and past, I guess.
So did you I don't know when you transitioned, but there's something that I kind of had when I was thinking about it, when I almost did it, was the idea that I needed to do it now because I wanted as much time to live my life as that gender as possible. Is that something that you kind of experienced as well?
No, it actually wasn't. I mean, I transitioned when I was 27. And it was more like, in a lot of cases, we do see, like I was saying, with the cultural forces and motive, kind of encouraging AGPs to transition. Same thing. I always had this desire to be male, or feeling that I was supposed to be male or should be male, but I kind of pushed it down as just like this childish fantasy until it was all around me in the culture. And so there are people online. I was reading about how accessible and easy it was. And once I had that notion, once I realized how accessible it was, though that dysphoric, like the feelings of dysphoria that I always managed to compartmentalize and tamp down, just became overwhelming and kind of like my just chronic, essentially.
For me, it was I was going through a lot. I was also in a very abusive relationship, and I kind of I ended up almost exit gaming myself. And I think that all of that together pushed it, because a lot of what you're saying actually makes a lot more sense. I've never really heard someone explain it in this way before, and I think that you're contextualizing it in a way that makes a hell of a lot of sense. And it's good to hear, and I'm really glad that we've done this, because I think it's going to be useful for people to listen to. But yeah, no, it's giving me a lot to think about. But I was going to say as well, I guess the other thing I wanted to ask is, do you think that it's an innate sexual orientation?
I don't. I think it's a maladaption is what I think it is. I think it's kind of the result of our kind of atomized existences. This is really controversial. One of the more controversial things I say is that it is highly correlated with autism spectrum disorders. And I think it's just this kind of cerebral, live in your head kind of person who is very susceptible to this, misfiring, essentially.
Because am I right in thinking that Blanchard originally, I don't know if he still does, but he did think that it was an innate sexual orientation at first, or is that right?
I think Blanchard and Bailey, Professor Michael Bailey, who wrote the Man Who Would Be Queen, kind of popularizing bringing Blanchard to a popular audience or a mass audience. Both of them, I believe, think that it is innate. I don't believe it is, just because I believe it's a spectrum, right? Yeah. And I think it's culture bound in a lot of ways, and kind of I just don't. But I also don't know if we can even that homosexuality isn't necessarily innate either. So
exactly, I think that exactly. I think it's hard to. I think Douglas Murray actually said in the second book that we're not even really sure that being gay is genetic. There's no proof for it. It's like it's just something that people said because it was a useful way of pushing forward the agenda, which it's true, and it was useful in that sense. But actually, we don't actually know that any of this is innate. It could all be environmental.
Yep. And I do believe that a lot of what previously resulted in gay now results in trans, and it's not for the reason people think it is. I think it is because people were using same-sex relationships to embody the opposite sex.
That's interesting. Okay.
Right. Yeah. So
can you expand on that a little bit, or?
So I think the best example, and this is your audience is it's like for and about men, but I think the best way to show this what I'm talking about is the butch femme culture. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it at all.
I know a few butch lesbians.
Okay. But so there's this culture that's gone back, decades and decades amongst lesbians, where one embodies like this really masculine type, kind of like a exaggerated heterosexual relationship. Essentially, there's the really feminine one, and then the butch masculine one. I think so much of it isn't innate. Like a lot of the butch identified women, and they aren't really. There isn't necessarily anything super masculine about their personalities. It seems to be a lot of cases just aesthetic. And I think, and then when transition became popular in the 90s and aughts, and then through like the 2015 is when it super exploded. But I think it was all the same thing. It was using kind of a romantic relationship with a more feminine other to enact this masculinity. I think that autogynephilia has resulted in a lot of gay men who are kind of insistent on that. They're like, they're the ones who are like talk about nonstop about being bottoms and how they're super feminine, and it's like their brand and their identity. I think this is actually a facet, a manifestation of autogynephilia. Because if you can't be a woman, the next best thing is basically as feminine a man as you can be. So I think in a lot of cases, this autoheterosexuality has resulted in homosexuality historically in a lot of cases. Not always. I'm not saying that's the primary cause of homosexuality, but I think it is one of a few.
It's fascinating because it's like God, I wrote about in the book recently the Mouse Utopia experiments. I don't know if you've heard of those. So
remind me.
It's basically where a Dr. John Calhoun put mice together in a situation. I'm closing my eyes because I can remember it. He put mice together in a situation where they had all of the resources they could possibly ever want. They had everything that they could need, but a limited amount of space. And what he found is that they would always have before the space was filled, they would always result in this kind of three types emerging, where especially amongst the males, this type emerged called the beautiful ones, where they ended up being essentially, they were mice, so not really, but essentially very similar to what you described, kind of AGP males. With the females, it's harder to pinpoint it because most of them just became socially withdrawn. But there is definitely this prospect that and it's hard to say this without people thinking of making a moralistic argument, because I'm not.
Yeah.
Is that in late stage civilizations, there definitely seems to be this trend of people popping up who kind of fit this bill. It seems to happen more and more. In a survival situation, people generally don't adhere to these sort of things because we're just breeding. That's all we have to do.
Right.
But as soon as we end up I'm becoming, with looking more into this, I'm becoming of the opinion that all of this stuff is kind of a trait of, like affluence in a way. It's a trait that we end up developing, and maybe it's some sort of evolutionary thing that gets picked up to make it so, all of this is just based on my assertion. I'm not a scientist, but like it's, it feels like there's some sort of evolutionary trait that's basically there to stop us reproducing too much and to stop us getting past a certain point. And this sounds very bleak, and I don't really mean it in a bleak way, but even in ancient Rome, there's a book called the Satires, and towards the end, the guy basically says, oh, all the men are behaving like Venus today. And it's like, it feels like this is something that happens in late stage civilizations over and over and over again. It doesn't necessarily lead to anything bad. It just feels like it's nature's way of capping us.
Yeah, it could be. I've got to notice the same thing, notice the same trend, or this, it's only in like really, I don't know, societies that tend to progress to such an extent that they aren't policing gender norms, and this does seem to be the signal of the decline.
Yes,
so
I don't want to say it that way because
Right.
it sounds alarmist, but like I don't necessarily mean it like that, because I don't necessarily think it always leads to decline. But when you look at the
I don't know if
historical
anyone's
pattern,
watching the news.
it tends to take a real shake up to stop it from the decline. Yeah.
It does. Yeah. So I guess I always thought of it as just kind of like not necessarily a facet of evolution, which I think is where you're coming from, whereas I always thought of it as more like just self-indulgence. It's like it's a product of self-indulgence, essentially, is how I see it. But it could be more natural than that. It could be more, or I'm just, or that's just one one result of this, right? Is the it's another, like we often say that dysphoria is a first world problem, and that's very much true. It's like we've got too much time, we're too bored to be obsessing about.
I mean, it's the same as if you look at kind of suicide rates, they go up in after all of these things seem to correlate with each other, and it does paint a little bit of a scary picture when you look at it all at once. But it worries me. It worries me a tiny bit, but then it doesn't at the other side, because there's also cultures that seem to pull it back from the edge. Like Japan's Edo period was very much like we are now, but then the Meiji Restoration came in, and suddenly everything kind of reverted back to normal. So it's like things do seem to go in cyclical cycles. I don't necessarily think it's like, oh, this big ending. The Roman Empire is one particular example where it does feel like it was very much at the end. And we even see that in films like Gladiator, where they have done the historical research. All of the rich people are always very kind of gender bending. It just seems like one of these observable truths. But okay, so I was going to say a question as well. I guess we kind of already covered it a bit, but what does being a man mean to you? As someone who has, you may not be a man, biologically, but you very much pass as one. And
I like to do the cop out of this one, is just say, well, being a man is being an adult human male, and I'm not one. So that's the easy answer. But
I do think there's something to be said, though, of, a lot of people say it's not true, but I do think there's something to be said that society puts gender on people in some way. Like it is
it's I guess I don't really know. I think that because by the time that I let go of the kind of wokey, gender is just whatever you feel like kind of thing, and so but by the time I like a man is just who occupies the role of male in society, or anyone who identifies as a man, or vice versa about women. I think about the same time that I let go of those kind of notions, I also let go of the idea that we can actually transcend these categories, right? And so I guess and then it's hard to answer this without going like really archaic, like back to what we're trying to bomb us into the Stone Age here about being like a protector and a provider and all those things. But yeah, it's a tough one to answer. Yeah.
Well, I think the simplest answers are often the best, and as I come back from it, and I do think that that's just being a protector and being a provider is kind of it. Like it is one of the main parts.
Right. It should be. Yeah.
Yeah. I think the simplest answer is often the best.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess as well, the other question would, how do you think we can provide a better framework for young men with all of these things in mind?
God, I guess, yeah, it's hard to answer these questions without being like the conservatives were always right.
I don't necessarily think the conservatives are right either. But that's the thing. I do think the answer is somewhere in the middle. Like, I know that's like a fallacy to say, but I do think it's true.
Yeah. I think, yeah, because if there's too much, kind of, I don't know, if it's too concrete, people will, push against it. If it's too malleable, then it's meaningless. So I don't know what the answer is. I think, we certainly need better role models of masculinity that aren't, the ones basically trying to get men to be like women, or then telling men they should be abusers like the Tates. Like, we
don't need more Romanian-based sex traffickers.
We don't. But considering there's just like an absolute dearth of actual, of actual men that are telling boys it's okay to be a man, like we just need more of them. That are
we need like as well. And also, I think we need more acceptance. Like the things that you're talking about make a lot of sense, and the way that you frame them make a lot of sense. I just think that men definitely need a lot more acceptance of who they are, and I think there's a lot more girls' sort of sexuality has looked more as like a fluid thing, and I don't know if that necessarily isn't true of men too. I think it's just society puts it on them that it isn't.
Well, I think so. In the studying of sexuality, like sexology and all that, I think it's pretty clear that female sexuality is less target specific, and so it is really kind of based on relationship dynamics and how you feel about someone, and it's very much kind of just really abstract, whereas male sexuality does tend to be more concrete and targeted, and not as malleable. But again, in the culture that we're living in, I think there is a lot of that shifting, because I think a lot of the like in AGP, for example, we see like the femboys, right? Where it's like I think that these men or these boys are baseline heterosexual, but what matters more to them than being with a woman is feeling feminine or being perceived that way. And so they're feminizing themselves, and they're ultimately their target attraction does become males. They do become actually externally attracted to men, but it's filtered through the desire to be feminine, to feel feminine relative to that person.
So that's what you're talking about with like meta attraction, where it's kind of like it's hard to say in words, but I do understand exactly what you're saying. It's like a want to be female in order to feel male through someone else. Would that be the right way of describing it?
Well, so with AGP, it would be an attraction to masculine men often, so that you can feel feminine relative to them. So not necessarily be a woman, but sometimes like feeling feminine is enough. And I think we do see this more often in females, just again because female sexuality is much more about relationship dynamics and stuff like that. But I think again, like as we get into this more gender bendy pervasive society, yeah, I think maybe the men are being feminized in like literally in that way, to actually have a more malleable, fluid female type sexuality. Yeah.
Okay, so final question would be, if you could tell your younger self something, what would it be?
This is such a tough one. I guess going back to kind of the thing that we've been on about is that slogan is true, not slogan, but that saying, if you don't have if you're not a liberal at 20, you don't have a heart. And if you're not a conservative at 40, you don't have a brain.
Yeah.
I tell my 20-year-old self that is unfortunately true. But yeah, I'm not sure what good that would do. Like the idea of like, an older you telling a younger you something, it's like your parents telling you, you're not gonna believe it. It's not gonna sink in.
I was interviewing someone else the other day, and he's a Christian now, and he said, if I told my younger self what I was now, it would be like, oh my God.
yeah, exactly. Yes. Oh no. Stop time. Yeah. And see, and that's I think Christianity is in a lot of ways the way to go. I do see, like, no matter, like, as far as the solutions, I was raised evangelical Christian. I've been an atheist my entire life. I can't stop being an atheist. I just don't believe that religions.
I wish I did. I mean, right? I've done ayahuasca. I've done the whole lot, and I still
okay.
I still can't.
Right. Yeah. I think it's good for individuals psychologically. I think it's good for societies to have like this moral framework that everyone abides by, and that does give people hope and meaning and purpose, etc. Rituals, things like that are all very, very good. And the fact that we have a combined one is good. I mean, obviously, we love like cosmopolitanism and diversity of thought and everything like that. But I think we do kind of societally and psychologically flourish when we're surrounded by people with the same moral framework that we have. But I guess I would to tell my younger self to stop making fun of religious people, because that might be the answer.
I always go into the whole quantum physics thing and like researching it, and when you get really into it, you're like, wait, this is just the Bible with extra steps. Like this is just the exact same thing, but with like all of this extra stuff.
Okay. I do not have the brain for it, so I'll take your word for it.
Like sometimes the simplest answer is the best. I think it was someone said like in the beginning of the Bible it says, in the beginning there was a word, and that word was God. Well, we could interpret that to mean vibration. And then in quantum physics, we say vibration makes everything. So it's like, so is that not just we've just taken a million more steps to get to the exact same thing that we've,
Okay. Yep.
Thank you so much for this. It's been really illuminating, and I think it'll be really interesting for people to hear. And thank you again. I really, really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for being here. It's been